Hi there, and welcome to the Grateful Podcast. My name's Michelle, and it's so great to have you here as we navigate what it means to lead and build a more just, generative, and joyful world. Today's episode, I thought it would be nice to chat about something that's become the foundation of a lot of the work that I do at the moment. I actually thought I was going to talk to you about something completely different today, but what I've noticed with podcasting is that it's really hard for me to record an episode on something I thought was very present for me last week, and then when I show up, it doesn't feel as alive. So I've just decided to switch to a topic that always feels very alive for me, and that is the relationship between our own well-being and the work that we do in the world. Put another way, our own well-being and the contribution that we make. And I realized I've been exploring this topic for a really long time, but it's only in the last kind of 6 or 7 years that it's become foundational to the work that I do. And so I wanted to share with you some thoughts about this. But more than me talking this episode, I wanted to carve out some space for you to reflect for yourself on your own relationship between well-being and contribution, and if there are any places where maybe some shifts or nudges need to happen for this relationship to be more generative and healthy for you. So I'm just going to start with a quick overview about why I care about this topic, some of the things I've been thinking about, and then hand over to you with some reflection questions that you can do yourself to dig deeper into your own perspective on this topic. I think a lot of people start thinking more deeply about the relationship between our own well-being and the work that we do when you get to a low point where you feel you don't have energy. Maybe it goes as far as a burnout, and you notice how that impacts the work that you're doing, and you start to perhaps become aware of the impact of the work that you're doing and how you're doing it on your own well-being. And that was definitely the case for me. About 6 or 7 years ago, I was in Spain at my yoga teacher's retreat center, starting my advanced yoga teacher training. And I was standing in my little room super early in the morning. It was like, I think it was before 5 a.m. or something. The sun wasn't even up. And I was just completely buzzing. I felt like I had so much energy. I felt so alive. And so I decided before we started practice in the morning that I would just go for a walk in this beautiful Andalusian countryside before heading to the morning meditation. And as I was walking, looking out over all the fields, I couldn't quite imagine how 5 days earlier I had arrived feeling so completely different. I had felt tired and drained, but somehow at the same time also wound up and kind of agitated in my mind, frantically trying to keep on top of everything and tick off my to-do list, get everything done for work before I gave myself permission to take a week offline. And within not even a week of doing meditation and movement and eating healthy food and being out in the nature and in good company, I felt so incredibly alive and vibrant and like myself again. And I realized I hadn't felt like that in a really long time. And often these are those moments where we have to start to ask ourselves some deeper questions. And so as I was leaving the retreat center and sort of watching these beige-colored wheat fields just slide past me in the window, I felt this kind of deeper knowing inside of me, like it was in my bones, that I really had to make some changes and I had to do it now. No more thinking about it, but actually it was time to take action. And it was right after that I decided to change my professional direction and make much more space for some of the things that had been quietly calling me, that felt like they were much more alive for me and what I needed to do. So much like with recording this podcast, I had to really feel into what is alive for me at the moment and what isn't, and be honest with myself and follow what was calling me in this moment. And in the 6 years leading up to that point, I'd been involved in building up a new organization, a really exciting process, but also one that involved a lot of different stakeholder expectations and management, and something that I'd thrown myself into really fully. I was really energized about the chance to try and make a meaningful contribution to food and sustainability challenges. But along the way, I'd lost myself a little bit. Sure, in parallel, I had kept practicing yoga, doing meditation, and doing other things that supported my well-being. But it was like I had these two tracks in my life. One was the professional track, the work track, the contribution track, the important one where the real things happened. And then on the side, this well-being track, which was something I traveled on when I had the time to do it, but I certainly didn't prioritize it. And I somehow didn't really make the connections between these two tracks in my life. I followed them separately without integrating them. And so it was at this point, coming back from this yoga training, that I realized you need to integrate these now. And perhaps integrating these two tracks and creating space for exploring that is also an important contribution you can make in the spaces that you occupy or in the spaces that you create. And it was at that point that I also started to notice the irony that I guess so many of us have working in spaces where we care about social or environmental issues, that I kind of dedicated my work and career to making a contribution to the well-being of the world. And along the way, somewhat neglected my own well-being. And I was starting to realize that that wasn't necessarily a personal failing, but that we're all kind of set up in that way by society because we have so few systems of care in place that really help us value and practice taking care of ourselves and each other while we're trying to make a contribution to a greater good. And so the more I thought about this, the more I started to see the connection between these two things, well-being and contribution, in kind of two ways. As I explored my own relationship to it and watched others, I started to see some patterns. And the first one is that either we can work on increasing our own well-being, which in turn increases the quality of our contribution to the collective well-being over the long term. And if we're contributing in a way that's fulfilling and sustainable for ourselves, then our contribution can in turn support our own well-being. So we can create this kind of positive feedback loop where our well-being feeds our contribution and our contribution feeds our well-being, both individually and collectively. And I think that's the place we all want to be. That's kind of the utopia that we're all imagining. But more often than not, this feedback loop is kind of moving in the opposite direction. We don't have enough space to support our own well-being. This diminishes our ability to make a contribution to our collective well-being or to the world around us. And the way that we make this contribution further depletes our well-being. So we're in this negative feedback loop. And this feedback loop only finally dampens out around our own burnout. And maybe you can kind of imagine this as I'm talking about it, like these two words, well-being and contribution, connected through these two arrows that make this loop. And it's kind of the decision, do we want to put a plus or a minus in the middle of this feedback loop that we're living our lives in the middle of. And we just keep seeing more and more evidence why this topic is so important for us to explore. I send out a monthly newsletter, and last month I shared an article that was titled, "Where to Start If You Feel Burned Out?" And it was the most clicked on article that I think I have ever shared in my newsletter. And I can only presume that people are clicking on it because they are starting to feel the symptoms of burnout in themselves or see it in their workplace, and they're looking for support that they're not necessarily finding in their immediate surroundings, or because they want to know more about how we can collectively tackle this global burnout epidemic that we're in at the moment. And earlier this year in February, the US think tank Future Forum released the results of a survey they'd done with 10,000 workers around the world. And about 42% of workers surveyed actually reported experiencing symptoms of burnout. And this was actually the highest figure since the survey was last done, which was back in May 2021, when we were still very much in the throes of the pandemic. So we can see this topic is actually getting worse and not better. And understandably then, given the situation we're in, there's a lot of really interesting books and research coming out at the moment about burnout, and they're helping us understand that this connection between well-being and contribution is not an individual's problem alone, which is how we've been tackling it for the longest time. So Alex Pang, who's the author of a book called Rest, Why You Get More Done When You Work Less, says the following: they've tended to think of burnout as a worker's responsibility. It's something that happens to you. It's typically been treated in the same category as health and fitness, rather than a phenomenon that employers allow to happen as a result of certain workplace conditions. Burnout is an organizational problem left for the individual to deal with. And I think the article that I shared in my newsletter was so enthusiastically clicked on because it had a similar angle. It talked about how too often all our discussions around well-being and burnout end at self-care. And of course, it's important that we take care of ourselves, but that self-care has to be real care that nourishes us at the level of being a human being. And that just means caring for all aspects of our life: the mental, the physical, the emotional, the relational, the spiritual, and actually being able to integrate all of these. But unfortunately, how we talk about self-care, particularly in the media, is often very superficial topics of manicures and beauty products and all kinds of other things that are trying to be sold as part of our self-care. And we all know how hard this self-care is, particularly this integral self-care is in practice. And that's often because we have systems all around us and systems we've internalized inside of us that don't make caring for ourselves the default. And what I liked in this article is they started to talk more about that we need to move from this lens of only talking about self-care to talk about the importance of systems of care if we want to tackle burnout and build our own well-being. One of the authors of this article, Christina Maslach, who is also the author of a book called The Burnout Challenge, has this really nice metaphor to explain what they're talking about here. She says, if you think of the mantra that has been around forever, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen, it's a recognition of a gap, a mismatch between the job and the person. But it's saying, it's your problem. If you can't do it, then go away. Don't be here. Meanwhile, nothing's being raised about the place itself. Could the heat be turned down? Could we redesign the kitchen to be a better place? The first response is to ask, is there some way to improve things here and make it better? Am I the only one who's unhappy with this? Maybe there are others. Rather than saying, I'm burned out, ask the team, could we rethink some of our processes? And so in this book, The Burnout Challenge, Christina Maslach has brought together decades of research that she's done on burnout and focuses it around 6 mismatches that we can see in this employee-employer dynamic that lead to burnout and lead to us collectively not being able to take care of our well-being. And these mismatches are a mismatch between workload, mismatch with control, a mismatch with rewards, a mismatch with community, a mismatch with fairness, and a mismatch with values. And it's a really nice way to start to look at this person and workplace fit and see what adjustments might need to happen on both sides, rather than saying that this topic is simply one for us individuals to take care of alone. Now, what I think is really interesting is that a lot of the people that subscribe to my newsletter actually work in organizations that are trying to make a positive social or environmental impact. Maybe that's through food or sustainable development or regenerative approaches. And so you might think that these organizations would actually be the ones with systems of care in place, given that their mandate is to contribute to a collective well-being. You would think that there would then be a stronger lens also for the well-being of the individuals in the organization. Well, you might be surprised or not if you work in some of these organizations, but I can't tell you how many clients I've worked with and organizations that I've seen myself that have a really noble purpose, but try and execute it through a work environment where this combination of limited resources and high internal and external pressure to make an impact, and maybe lacking leadership and relational skills combine to make some really unsustainable and even toxic working settings. So this well-being contribution interface needs to really be explored everywhere, even in the places where you might think or hope they would be best practice examples already. And it's funny, I have a database where I jot down ideas of topics that I kind of keep seeing that I think I should do a podcast or write about. And I have had this note to myself for ages that I keep upvoting myself that just simply says, great mission, but treat people like crap internally, which, although not very articulately expressed, I think sums up this challenge that I certainly keep seeing. And I'm wondering if it's something that you see or experience yourself as well. And of course, what I've shared here is completely anecdotal. They're just patterns that I'm seeing and hearing. But it seems others are picking this up too and starting to study it and test the assumptions in these trends a little further. And just last week, a group in the US called Climate Critical Earth actually released a report which was called the Climate Burnout Report. And they surveyed people from 108 organizations across the US to explore burnout in the climate and environmental change workforce. And you might not be surprised by what they found. The survey and the focus group findings suggest that people across the climate and environmental change sectors are burning out at high rates. Nearly all of the respondents that participated in their survey reported burnout symptoms like acute negative feelings of physical and mental pain, exhaustion, indifference, hopelessness, powerlessness. And many of the participants mentioned that their burnout was specifically related to being in the climate and environmental space because they experienced feelings of depression around not being able to move the needle on their work, the frustrations of political roadblocks and funding restrictions, and feeling that all they were doing was incremental and reactionary, but not systemic like it needs to be. And they also noted that they feel really overwhelmed by these environmental and climate challenges and questioned a lot whether their work was really doing enough to combat these bigger problems. So this was a survey of just 240 respondents and just in the US, so it's obviously not representative either of the whole sector or what's going on globally. But I do think it gives us more information and evidence that this is a topic that we need to dig much deeper into. And there's a nice quote in the report that says, "There's an essential need to make space for the messiness of human-scale restoration and repair. That requires that we, the people, create some norms, language, and practices that consider the emotional costs of trying to do work for everyone on Earth. It's time for deep and durable investments in whole people and whole solutions for the whole planet." And while we're talking about interesting books and authors exploring this topic of burnout, I also want to talk about one that's become one of my recent favorite authors. And that's Tricia Hershey, who is the founder of something called the NAP Ministry, which is a movement that I absolutely love. And the message of the NAP Ministry and her book, which is called Rest is Resistance, a manifesto, is on the surface relatively simple. Take a nap, rest. But when you dig into it, it's really deep, and it helps us start to see that rest and taking care of our own well-being isn't just a nice to have. Indeed, it might actually be a radical act, that we could actually start to see regeneration as resistance. And her work is fascinating. It's actually grounded in an academic analysis of the systemic roots of the constant overwhelm that we see in society and that impacts particular groups even more. So she draws from Black liberation theory, womanist theory, Afrofuturism, reparations theory, somatics, and community organizing. And from all of this, her conclusion, I think, is really beautiful. It's that in rest, we find collective liberation. And instead of writing papers, she has created this manifesto in the book, and maybe even more importantly, actually invites people to come and nap together. When she started offering these group naps, the sessions booked out instantly. and she combines it with beautiful music. I'm going to put the link to her song at the bottom as well so you can listen to it. But I just think that the way she approaches this makes this really compelling argument for rest. By connecting this depletion and burnout that we're seeing everywhere back to the origins of capitalism in agricultural plantations and slavery. And once we start to think about this topic of well-being and rest at this deeper level, I think we can't unsee the deeper connections between it and the contribution and the changes that we might want to make in the world. So I'm going to put all of these resources at the bottom of the show notes so you can definitely check it out yourself if you want some more inspiration, as well as just a nice podcast episode with Trisha Hershey where she unpacks a lot of her core messages that I hope inspire you. And in this podcast, she talks a lot about something that I really believe as well, and that is that we can't make these important system connections or envisage the world that we want to build when we're all completely exhausted and burnt out. We need to rest so that we can make these connections, we can dream, we can vision, we can imagine the world we actually want to build and find the resources in ourselves and in connection to others to actually walk in that direction. So I don't want to say much more about this because I want you to have some space to dig deeper into your relationship with this topic. What I'm guessing is what I've said so far there maybe isn't a lot that's completely new to you. It's kind of the irony of this topic that it's something that we all somehow already know inside of ourselves. It's like we just keep forgetting it and we have to constantly be reminded that our well-being and our contribution are intimately connected. And even if we're reminded about it, it takes a lot to move from knowing something to actually changing something. First, we have to become aware of it. Then we need to understand it. Then we need to start practicing new things. And then finally, through that practice, change actually comes about. So with that in mind, that's why I thought it would be nice in this episode to just help you carve out some space to reflect more deeply on this topic for yourself from this perspective of both the individual and the collective. So I've got a few journaling and reflection questions for you, which I'm going to read out now. And then the invitation is to simply pause the podcast, write your responses, and then hit play again when you're ready for the next one. Or if you prefer to work with written prompts, I've got a link in the show notes for you where you can find a written overview of all of the questions that I'll share. And you could do this reflection alone, or you could do it together with some colleagues, with family and friends, and then chat together about what came up for each of you and what the path forward might be. Before we dive into those questions, there's just one last thing I wanted to share, and that's a little disclaimer. I've focused in this episode about this connection between well-being and contribution, but I just really want to make it clear that I don't think the main reason you should care about your own well-being is so that you can make a sustained contribution to the world around you. I think that might be a nice side effect. I think if we care about making a contribution, it's important for us to make these connections. But I think you should take care of yourself and I should take care of myself because we are human beings who have the privilege of being alive here on this earth at the moment. You already and always deserve nourishment and taking care of yourself. And I do find it really interesting to highlight this interface of well-being and contribution because it's so often the irony that while trying to make a contribution to the greater good, we deplete ourselves in the process. And I know many of you are here listening to this podcast because you do care about making a positive impact. And so that's why I offer you this space to explore this topic. So to help you get ready for some reflection, why don't we do a few rounds of mindful breathing together? Help calm the nervous system and get you in a headspace where you're ready to reflect. If you would like to, just gently closing the eyes or taking the gaze to a focal point on the wall or the floor in front of you. Just taking a moment to notice any sensations in the body. returning the awareness to the breath without changing the breath in any way, just simply observing each inhalation and each exhalation. We'll now do a few rounds of mindful breathing together, simply inhaling for a count of 3 and exhaling for a count of 6. And I'll guide you through the breath so that you can just relax into it. Beginning now with an inhalation. Exhaling. Inhaling. Exhaling. Inhaling. Exhaling. Inhaling. Exhaling. Inhaling. Exhaling. Inhaling. Exhaling, and as you do so, just imagining your whole body relaxing, like it's melting. Inhaling. Exhaling to release and let go. Inhale. Exhale. One last round, inhaling and exhaling. Taking the awareness back into the body, you can gently wiggle the fingers and the toes. Feel free to take any stretching or movement that you feel like you need. Now finding yourself a pen and paper or a journal or whatever you like to use to take notes. And the first few reflection questions I have for you are more from the perspective of individual self-care, of your own well-being. And the first reflection question is, how do you perceive your own well-being and your contribution to be connected at the moment? How are they interacting with each other in this phase of your life and work? So feel free to hit pause now and journal your response and then play again when you're ready for the next question. And the next part of this question is, with this relationship as it currently is, how do you see the future for yourself and for the contribution that you want to make to the greater good? The next reflection question is, we can think of self-care as being about nourishing your own spiritual, physical, intellectual, relational, and emotional well-being. Sometimes this is summarized with the acronym SPIRE. When you think about these 5 different aspects of being human, which practices are most important for you to nourish these different areas of your life? So spiritual, physical, intellectual, relational, and emotional. Once you've thought about those practices, the next part of the question is, what currently gets in the way of you engaging with these practices as often as you would like to? And here you can play a little game with yourself. Each time you answer this question, what gets in the way of you engaging with these practices, then continue to ask yourself, and what leads to that? So you're helping yourself to dig deeper and deeper here. So whatever your first answer is, often it's related to not having time or not having space, for example, then ask yourself, and what leads to that? And continue doing that a few times to dig deeper. The next reflection question is, can you think of anyone who seems to have a positive feedback loop established when it comes to well-being and contribution? Meaning that looking after their own well-being positively influences their ability to make a contribution, and the way they make their contribution positively impacts their own well-being. And if you can think of someone here, what have you noticed about their mindset, the practices they engage with, and how it is they show up and do their work? The next part of that question is, what systems of care do you think support them and enable them to do this? The next few questions are ones to help you think more about systems of care and collective well-being. What systems of care exist in your current professional setting? How might you be able to tap into them? And are there any gaps that you think need to be filled? And the next question is, how could you help create more space to explore the well-being contribution interface in your organization? Who might be interested to have these conversations with you, and who could you start talking to about this? So there are a lot of interactions between our individual and our collective well-being, burnout, and systems of oppression. And systems of oppression is this lens that we can use to try and understand better the ways that any type of oppression, whether that's related to race or gender, class, language, sexual orientation, how that might impact someone's ability to make progress on the things that they care about, to take individual or collective action, and even to be able to support their own well-being. And if we think about systems of oppression, I wanted to invite you to think for yourself what you might see the links being between our own well-being, our ability to take care of ourselves, and systems of oppression that we might be exposed to. And then, do you observe or experience any of these systems of oppression playing out in your workplace at the moment? And the last question is more a practice, actually, just the invitation to, at the end of each day, ask yourself, how did I take care of myself today? And what systems of care supported me? Maybe this is even a little checkout question that you could do with your team if you are interested in carving out some more time to explore this topic in your professional setting. So now that you've done all of this journaling, take a look back over what you've written. What patterns do you see? What new insights have you gained? And can you think of one small practice or habit or change that you want to make now that could help improve your own relationship between well-being and contribution? If this exploration or today's episode has raised questions for you about whether you're experiencing symptoms of burnout or exhaustion syndrome, then I just really wanted to encourage you to take that seriously and seek out support for it. So I'm going to place a link in the show notes to something that's called the Burnout Assessment Tool. It's not to be used for diagnosis, but it's a nice tool to help you explore this topic further and see if indeed these symptoms are present for you in a way that would really encourage you to seek further support. And if that's the case, then to find a trained and qualified health professional that can help you unpack this further and explore a diagnosis and an appropriate support plan for you. I just want to close out the episode today with a reading from a book called The Dance by Uriah. What if it truly doesn't matter what you do, but how you do whatever you do? How would this change what you chose to do with your life? What if you could be more present and open-hearted with each person you met, if you were working as a cashier at a corner store or as a parking lot attendant, than you could if you were doing a job you think is more important? How would this change how you want to spend your precious time on this earth? What if your contribution to the world and the fulfillment of your own happiness is not dependent on discovering a better method or technique, on reading the right book, attending the right seminar, but on really seeing and deeply appreciating yourself and the world as they are right now? What if there is no need to change, no need to try to transform yourself into someone who is more compassionate, more present, more loving or wise? How would this affect all the places in your life where you are endlessly trying to be better? What if the task is simply to unfold, to become who you already are in your essential nature, gentle, compassionate, and capable of living fully and passionately present. How would this affect how you feel when you wake up in the morning? What if who you essentially are right now is all that you are ever going to be? How would this affect how you feel about your future? What if the essence of who you are and always have been is enough? How would this affect how you see and feel about your past? What if the question is not why am I so infrequently the person I really want to be, but why do I so infrequently want to be the person I really am? How would this change what you think you have to learn? What if becoming who and what we truly are happens not through striving and trying, but by recognizing and receiving the people and places and practices that offer us the warmth of encouragement we need to unfold? How would this shape the choices you make about how to spend today? What if you knew that the impulse to move in a way that creates beauty in the world will arise from deep within and guide you every time you simply pay attention and wait? How would this shape your stillness, your movement, your willingness to follow this impulse, to just let go and dance? I think this is a really beautiful reading, and it gets to this essence of perhaps how we do things is as important as what we do. And that's a central question for us to explore if we care about making a positive impact in the world. What if we shift our attention as much to how we're doing it and see how that impacts the impact we have, but also our own well-being and fulfillment along the way? So I hope this episode offered you some space for reflection and contemplation. I'd love to hear anything that came up for you, so feel free to write me on podcast@thegrateful.com. Maybe there's another topic you'd love to explore in a future episode. Please just let me know. I'm always super happy to hear from you. Thanks for listening today, and see you next time.